rather than society, a person who suffers a loss. And what justice demands is that the offender compensate him for the loss. The robber doesn't rob society, the robber robs the victim. Now, there are two basic models of this, punitive and pure. In punitive restitution, the intention is to restore the victim, but it is to do so in the course of or by inflicting some unpleasantness on the offender. And that the criminal is to be hurt in order to restore the victim is shown by the reluctance people have to accept out-of-pocket buyouts. Criminal does something, causes a harm, you say, don't throw me in jail, just let me pay for the harm. And we're reluctant to do that. So there's still a, right, we still think, you haven't really paid up properly if all you're doing is giving the person, damages for the harm you caused them when you stabbed them in the arm. Right? That's not a proper payoff. Right? And so the idea here is that even understood as restitution, some harm has to be visited on the violator. It is interesting to note that it was a traditional remedy for monetary debts, that if you don't pay your debt, your creditor gets to physically harm you. Why, yes. Think of the Merchant of Venice. Right? You didn't pay me, I get to exact my pound of flesh for the debt. Right? And indeed, this is a prominent theme in Nietzsche on the genealogy of morals. The proper payment for debt, the originary payment for debt, is the right to harm someone, to physically to harm them. And the lesson that Nietzsche takes from this is, right, we're a violent creature, human beings. Right? We regard it as a good thing for us if we get to cause other human beings suffering. So good that we would do that just as soon as we would take their money because of what they owe us. It's a big theme for Nietzsche. And in particular, it analyzes Christian morality as fundamentally grounded in this fact, that we wish to cause harm to those who have mastery over us in some way, to those who have done something we don't like, who exhibit, right, who got our money, right? What we want is to cause them harm. Anyway, I just wanted to point that out. In any event, this is not the model of restitution that Barnett is going to promote. He's going to promote the pure version, in which there simply is no punitive element. It is no part of the program that what you want to do is harm the offender. That's not part of the point at all. On this model, the criminal is made to pay the victim, just simply to pay the victim for the cost of the harm they've done, and also to pay for their costs of apprehension and conviction. If the violator has the money to just pay out of pocket, that's that. Done. If they don't, then, if they are trustworthy, once apprehended and convicted, then they're free and allowed to pay on some schedule. Okay? We trust you, right? You'll pay. You have a job. You're good for it. You'll pay on time. If not, if they're not trustworthy, they are to be confined to an employment project. some sort of business enterprise in which they work for wages that cover both the cost of their upkeep and go toward paying their debts. Since the aim isn't punitive, there's no reason that the violator couldn't, for example, have their family with them in the employment project. We're not trying to make them, we're not trying to harm them. We're not trying to deprive them of, pleasures, etc. We're just trying to get them to pay their debt. Okay? If they refuse to work, they're not entitled to the upkeep and not entitled to release. So there arises the question, what do you do with them? But here's the thing. These employment contracts or these employment projects, they're businesses. They are industrial enterprises of one sort or another, right? They're private business ventures. So companies might be willing to suffer some losses on some of their convicts, as it were, to make a profit on the labor of others. So, you want a contract it'll end up being a contract with an insurance company to confine and try to squeeze labor and profit out of people trying to pay off their debts. You may end up having to take some losses in order to make your gains. Some of them might not be willing to do the work. Okay. So, privatization. The employment projects, as I said, are private enterprises. And the idea is that crime insurance would become standard. We have health insurance, some of us do anyway. Automobile insurance, well, you'd take out a crime insurance policy. Individuals, because of the threat that they might be victims of crime, would pay premiums to be insured against losses caused by crime. We pay premiums to be insured against losses caused by weather, caused by accidents, caused by health. Well, just think of crime as another potential cost in life that you can pay insurance to be indemnified from. Insurance companies would then, having been paid in premiums, would pay these premium payers for their loss, and they would be the ones to receive the compensation from the criminal/business that the criminal is consigned to. Now, insurance companies would have a great incentive to capture and see offenders convicted. Victims, remember when we talked about the punitive or the punishment model, victims have no incentive in that model to participate at all in the capture and conviction of criminals. Right? Victim cooperation in capturing and conviction would be perhaps a condition in the insurance contract. You don't get paid out. You don't get a payout unless you cooperate. Victims would also have an incentive to ensure everyone would have an incentive to ensure efficient, successful employment projects. Okay? And you could have a lot of flexibility in a system like that, including, for example, arbitration between the insurance company and the convict, or arbitration between the insurance company and the accused, right? For example, suppose the insurance company thinks, well, conviction isn't certain here, and the criminal thinks, yeah, conviction isn't certain, but it's possible here. Maybe if I just, say, well, I'll pay you half, but you don't have to go through the cost of convicting me. Because if you go through the cost of convicting me, you're going to want all of it. Or maybe we could have arbitration. It's like plea bargaining, just in the private sector. This flexibility is built into the very idea of a restitution system, since its sole aim is to make the offender pay for the victim's compensation. All right. How do you determine how much is owed? Yeah.
So I was confused on where the reading is.
Yeah.
Am I paying my insurance in the?
No, that in the event that a crime is committed against you. Right? So you're paying insurance so that they will directly compensate you for your loss in the event some crime is committed against you. What you exchange, as it were, for that is the right, is you give them the right to seek the compensation directly from the person who harmed you.
So the interesting thing, I guess, about that is like, I pay for car insurance, I pay for that I injure someone else.
Either way, you also pay for car insurance in the event that somebody hits your car.
So why isn't it? Would it be two-way here?
Well, I'm going to say, yeah, possibly, because really what this does, the effect of this, is to obliterate the distinction between crimes and torts. Right? A tort is the intentional or unintentional infliction of damage on someone. Okay, but that's not criminal. Okay. The only thing that the criminal law is for on this model is compensating people for harms that are done to them. Indeed, it might not even be, as we'll see, the whole what's called the mens rea, the mental element of crime, right? That now you can't be convicted of a crime unless there's always a mental element that has to be proved. That might just, so intention to do some act, right? That might entirely lapse with a system like this. And it might be possible. But the problem would be, you're right, when you pay your insurance company, your automobile insurance company, they're not insuring you against accidents that you deliberately cause. Right? So we think of crime as deliberately causing a harm, and you wouldn't be insured against that. Well, I mean, I don't know, maybe. I mean, this is so out in left field in so many ways that it's very hard to say exactly what the consequences, what the market would turn up as a solution. But that's what we're dealing with here, is a kind of market solution to the problem of what we call crime. And it has some of the virtues and many of the vices with market solutions. Yeah.
So would the natural kind of extension of this be that these forces are replaced with insurance agencies? Because insurance, like we said on the last slide, have the incentive to capture and cooperate.
Sure, why not? I mean, look, that sounds ridiculous, right? And there's very much about this that's going to sound ridiculous when you really look at it. But it's a new paradigm, right? New paradigms always sound ridiculous at first. The Earth moves? Are you kidding me? For-profit police forces? Police forces? Are you kidding me? But does it exploit more obviously, or in fact is this just as exploited?
Yeah, I mean, it would be, but, we have like, combination and the
Yeah.
market, heavily.
Yeah. question, I mean, a question to keep in mind here is, okay, so where are the criminals' legal protections against abuse in this? Are we going to just leave that to the market? But anyway, yeah. So determining amount owed. How do we do that? Well, it's easy in the case of crimes against property. You just find out the fair market value of the property in question. You stole my diamond necklace. The diamond necklace is worth such and such on the market. So that's how much you owe me if you stole it, plus the costs, plus you got to repay the costs of conviction and prosecution, or rather apprehension and prosecution. But what about bodily harms, crimes against persons? Well, the fact is, we do this regularly in civil cases, put monetary numbers on people's limbs and lives. Insurance companies do it all the time, right? But it is challenging, right? How much, there's a saying in the I don't know. Yeah, a dead body is worth way less than a live one that's injured. That is to say, if you hit somebody with your car and it looks like you're going to be responsible for paying out, right? If you didn't kill them, back up and hit them again, because it's much cheaper, right, to compensate for a death than for a serious injury. All right. But look, that's a problem in the paradigm. But we already have this problem in various ways, and we deal with it, with insurance. And at least in this paradigm, something is being done to restore the victim, which is not happening in the punishment paradigm. What are some advantages of the restitution system? It provides a system to the victim, assistance to the victim. It gives them an incentive to aid in the prosecution, so you'll have fewer unsolved crimes. It actually does aid in the rehabilitation of the convict because they're given an incentive to learn whatever trade or job they're consigned to, because the length of their sentence in terms of time is up to them. They just have to be real productive. The more productive they are, the more they earn while on the confinement job, the faster they get out. They have an incentive to be productive and efficient so that they can get released. That is to say, the offender has some control over their sentence. It saves an awful lot of taxpayer dollars. And crime on the, if you think about this model, right? The idea is crime would literally not pay. Under the punishment system, how many movies have you seen where the whole theme is the dude is in jail for the crime and he can't wait to get out so that he can go cash in, get the loot which he hid somewhere. Right? You have an incentive to commit crimes of if the amount you've stolen is big enough and you can hide it away, you might well have an incentive to say, look, I can do 2 years easy. For this, for this stash of dough that I got out of it, I could do the 2 years and I'll be rich when I get out. That's just not the case with this, because how much you have to pay back in is tagged directly to how much you took. So what's the incentive to do crime when all you have to do is pay it back? And now, of course, the thought is, and insurance companies will have so much incentive to convict you that apprehension and conviction rates will go way up, but there's a hitch there. We'll see. Not a hitch, but it's actually, is it a bug or is it a feature? You know, always a question, right? But there's just no chance that a person who's convicted of a crime will be nonetheless better off for having committed it. Now there is, right, a chance, there's a way in which crime might literally pay, and that's just if the benefit to the offender was worth more than the harm done to the victim. So this idea that crime would never pay is based on the idea that however much, whatever the criminal did to the victim, right, is worth as much to the victim as it is, right? The victim's loss is equal to the criminal's gain, and that's not always going to be the case. So I mean, it's in fact built into the economic efficiency model, right, which says some people value some goods more than others, right? So if I would be willing to pay $1,000 for it, and you would be willing to sell it for $800, and I just steal it from you, then all I have to do is pay you $800, but now I have the thing that's worth $1,000 to me. But that's a little bit of, then crime would pay, but it would be efficient, right? That would be an efficient transfer. So, okay, not a problem. Yeah. Yes, presumably it would raise the likelihood. But wouldn't it also raise the likelihood that someone would be captured and convicted even though they weren't guilty? So what's the safeguard against that that's built into the system? That's a little hard to say, but wait. Right? We're not interested in the question here so much of not harming people who don't deserve it. We're interested in making victims whole. So it is not really internal to the system quite so much that it's only the criminals that should do the paying. And indeed, if you think of the insurance scheme, it's directly the insurance companies that are doing the paying, and they just have to come up with some efficient means to arrange their ability to do so. And it's just it's a market solution. And maybe there are going to be some externalities in terms of, people who didn't cause harms ending up having to pay for them. And besides, we're not harming you. We're just confining you to a work project. That's not, the point isn't to harm you. It's one thing to harm somebody who didn't do anything to deserve it. It's another thing to have them participate in a reimbursement scheme. Or is it another thing? Okay. Come on. Objections. Here's a practical objection. This fails to take account of the harm to society that is done by crime. It does take account of the harm done to the victim, but not the harm done to society. He just says, look, the test of how much society feels harmed or not is going to be whether they prefer this system to the punishment system. And he's willing to bet, given the cost savings, et cetera, And the fact that victims are actually benefited by this, they'll prefer this system and tolerate whatever abstract harm is done to society that isn't compensated for. Another objection. Monetary sanctions are insufficient to deter crime. Answer. Well, that's an empirical question. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. But remember, the aim here is restitution, not deterrence. We're not trying to prevent crime. Indeed, what we're trying to do here is make sure that such crime as is committed is Kaldor-Hicks efficient, basically, so that you can pay back out of your gains. And now we've already seen with the law and economics school, which this is a chapter of, right, that Kaldor-Hicks efficient transactions are to be promoted. So torts, the aim of tort law isn't to eliminate unintentional harms, it's to make sure that we have an efficient level of harms. And similarly, the aim of this is to make sure we have an efficient level of crime. And I say, right, crime this way because the line between torts and crimes is vanishing. I mean, I think the similar proposal would be where you have torts and you have people who are incapable of paying their damages for tort, they ought to be put in an employment project too. Okay, C, objection C. The employment project just isn't feasible. That idea is not feasible. No one will be willing to work. Indeed, that's why the people who commit crimes commit them. Right? They don't want to work, so they steal instead. Anyway, forced labor is a form of slavery. Okay, in response to this sort of objection, Barnett says, well, there were going to be administrative problems. That's for sure. It's going to be hard to get people to work sometimes. Right? But this objection assumes that people are irrational. Right? Currently, crime does pay. Conviction rates are low enough, and the benefits of doing the crime are high enough so that it does pay. It's not that people commit crime because they don't want to work. It's that they choose crime as their work, is the idea. It's not irrational to engage in crime. Indeed, especially in an unjust society, particularly one that makes it difficult for unskilled workers to get jobs, and that also makes illegal some services that are in high demand, gambling, prostitution, drugs. Make that stuff illegal, there's a high demand for it, perfectly rational to run the risks of prosecution in order to reap the benefits of those black markets. Especially in underprivileged communities where there are very few alternatives. So, right, the idea that monetary sanctions won't deter crime is based on the idea that people will not respond rationally to monetary incentives, but crime happens because they do respond rationally to monetary incentives. So the premise of the objection is undercut. People might prefer life of crime as a lifestyle choice. And that may be immoral, but it's not irrational. And besides, there's no forced labor here. There's a choice. Work or stay confined. work off your debt and get released, or don't and stay confined. No one's forcing you to work. All right, another kind of objection, distributory objection. Look, rich people can just commit crimes and just pay. Poor people can't. Poor people are going to be the ones that go to jail, that go to work projects, and then get exploited for profit. Rich people can just fork over the debt. Isn't that, can't rich people just sort of commit crime with impunity? If it's worth it to them, they get to commit crimes. The poor, on the other hand, can't pay off the debt, have to go into these forced labor situations. These situations in which they either labor or are stuck there. So what's the response to that? Look, the costs of committing crime are going to be very high. The employment project needs to turn a profit, right? And you don't have to just pay back for what the victim gets compensated. You also have to pay back for the costs of apprehension and trial. So the cost of crime is going to be very high. And because the employment projects need to turn a profit, right, there won't be much incentive for them to actually apprehend people who are unlikely to be able to pay off the cost of the crime that they've done. That is to say, if the criminal's really poor, and if they, were they to get out, would still be really poor, right? They're not going to have a lot of incentive to do the work in the forced labor situation, in the confinement, right? And so there might not be any point in chasing after them. However, a rich criminal, oh boy, is there a point in prosecuting and convicting them. Right? The poor would be unable to pay their debt, and so there'd be no reason to prosecute them. Or little reason to prosecute them compared with the rich. So it's not like the rich would just get away with it. Right? The rich would be the ones who would be the primary targets of apprehension and conviction. Of course, that's nice in theory, but who wouldn't like a cheap labor force that is under confinement until they pay off their debt, which, by the way, includes the costs of confining them. So they got to pay off their room and board, and these are often people who couldn't earn enough money for room and board in the world. Now you're going to put them in a situation in which they have to pay for room and board, plus pay off a debt, plus enable the insurance company to turn a profit, or the business to turn a profit. So this could look like a recipe for just, getting an awful lot of cheap labor.
Basically like migrant work. That model.
Yeah. Yeah. So insurance companies have great incentive to capture and convict rich defendants, less to capture and convict poor ones who'd be difficult to get to work. The insurer would have an incentive to demand less from poor criminals also, so as to incentivize their work, right? So remember the arbitration sort of element, right? Yeah, we know that you actually caused this much debt, we had to pay out this much, but we don't think you'll ever pay that off. So in order to incentivize you to work while you're here, we'll say, if right, the payment we had to make out because of what you did was $1 million, you'll never work that off. But if you work off 50,000, right, that might incentivize you to actually do the work so that you can get out in 3 years. You never get out if we have to work off $1 million, but we want to make what we can off of you. So let's say you only have to do 50,000. Yeah.
The insurance companies are private agents. Maybe this is like a niche difficulty, but like, wouldn't super rich private insurance?
Oh, super rich criminals do own private insurance companies.
Yes, right. So like, if those types of rich defendants violated, in theory, they would actually be above if the enforcer.
Well, that's why you need a market in insurance companies, right? So they'd have to be very careful to only commit crimes against people who were insured by them. But I'm sure there's a market solution. There's a market solution. So that, anyway, you would get unequal treatment of offenders. Rich offenders would be treated more harshly in the system than poor offenders. But look, the point of the system is to make the victims whole. Offenders don't have any right to equal treatment. It's just not part of that's not part of the point of the system, to treat violators fairly. The point is to make victims whole. Some other features of the new paradigm. The distinction between criminal and civil liability would be blurred. Insanity wouldn't be a defense. You either did the harm, you either caused the loss or you didn't. Right? Either way, you caused it. Doesn't matter whether you caused it intentionally, you caused it. You need to pay it off. Right? We're not punishing you for having been bad. We're making sure that you pay off the costs of the harms you do, of the losses you cause. Okay? And that's just part of the distinction, of the obliteration of the distinction between criminal and civil liability. There's the distinctive mens rea in criminal cases, where you have to prove an element of intention, right? That's generally not the case in civil suits, right? You get negligence maybe, but negligence is not, right? That's not the same thing as malice, as we saw. And indeed, negligence is, in the end, it's not even, right? It's just a matter of efficiency. It's defined by many courts just in terms of, well, would it have been more efficient for you to have avoided this than to have done it? And if it would have been more efficient for you to have taken steps to avoid it, you count as negligent for not having done so. Right? That's not a measure of whether the person was careless, was like, oh, I thought intellectually, oh, well, I don't care. Right? It's just a measure of whether it would have been more efficient for them to have taken a step. Anyway, there would be no victimless crimes. If there's no victim, there's no one to compensate. So right there, you get a whole large category of crimes that are just off the books, no longer on the books. So consensual sex between, just anybody, not a crime. There's still some anti-sodomy laws on the books someplace. Not a crime, right? Gambling, not criminal. No victim. And arguably also drug use. No victims. So you get rid of all those black markets, you get rid of, therefore, a whole lot of profit motive for people to engage in illegal activity in order to satisfy those markets. Then those markets become much more efficient, and all the actual crime that's committed in order to that's committed in the course of engaging in what is an illegal activity in order to avoid detection and silence people who would testify against you, and et cetera, et cetera. All of that goes away. Mind you, we could do that anyway without privatizing the criminal justice system, right? But anyway, and you would have massive reforms of loosening of criminal procedure, since there's no longer an aim to harm the criminal. And so all the protections that we have in criminal procedure that are designed to avoid harming the innocent, avoid doing intentional harm to the innocent, that goes away because we don't conceive it as harming them. Okay? And there's no longer a need to prove a mental element. So, for example, in civil lawsuits, right, the burden of proof is just a preponderance of the evidence. More likely than not that this person caused that harm negligently. Okay? Right? But if we're thinking of criminal law as now just a sort of more civil law, right? We're not thinking of, right? In other words, the reason that we insist that the criminal in that a defendant in a criminal case be convicted by beyond a reasonable doubt is because we don't want to inflict intentional harms on innocent people. But now we're not inflicting an intentional harm. We're just making them pay damages. Right? And that's not the intentional infliction of a harm. And so we don't need a standard of proof that's beyond a reasonable doubt. Preponderance, yeah.
You consider this paradigm, like in taking away kind of the element of like would incentivize like persecuting or prosecuting like politically damaging or like crimes which the prosecution of is like potentially politically damaging, like you think like white collar crime, for example, isn't usually like prosecuted at the rate that
right,
more like petty crime is. Do you think that this model would kind of do away with?
Well, I mean, so what you're suggesting is I'm having a little trouble grasping the worry. After all, it's insurance companies who are going to be pursuing pursuing people and trying to convict them.
Yeah.
So what is the motive for insurance companies here?
So because like it is like solely intended, to repay the victim, like a white collar crime that like has more like broad-based economic impact on, shareholders or whatever that may be. Like I feel like in this system they would be more incentivized to prosecute that.
Oh, entirely possibly.
Yeah.
I mean, what it'll be more incentivized to go after people with a lot of money.
Yeah, yeah. So more even, moreover than just like prosecuting the rich murderer versus the poor murderer, they're just like prosecuting a whole like realm of crimes that aren't really crimes.
Well, there is the question that hasn't been really addressed of what things are going to get to count as crimes.
Yeah.
And it's going to be whatever gets to be determined to have a, to cause a loss to anyone.
Yeah,
But that's a super hard question, what counts as a loss?
yeah, I guess that's
Yeah, it's a super hard question, what counts as a loss?
Yeah.
Right, so if I engage, if I'm a shareholder, or no, I'm on the board of directors at a company and I engage in some insider trading and make a mint,
Yeah.
right? What's the loss associated with that? Is it it's the opportunity to have made some of that money that shareholders and other investors would have had I not jumped the gun and operated on the basis of private information, thereby mucking with the pricing? Yeah, yeah. So are we going to call that a loss or not? I mean, presumably, the idea of, oh, yes, we'll call that a loss because it's an inefficiency when that happens, because it's taking advantage of a market failure. Right? But who's the victim? Who is it exactly that gets compensated? Right? Hard to tell. That's maybe why antitrust violations should be criminally prosecuted, because there's nobody clear to compensate for the loss. So if you want to disincentivize it, you make it criminal. Anyway, it's a good question. Okay, but look, so some further words. Yes, Sam.
I might get to it, so I'll
All right. Okay. The basic worry here that you're all attuned to: criminal law, quote unquote, enforcement fundamentally undertaken by profit-making enterprises. Right? Seriously, right? A company's fundamental, an insurance company like any other company, and presumably these would be publicly traded. So the directors have a fiduciary responsibility to maximize profits. That's their responsibility. So they would have not just incentives, but responsibility to pay as little on claims as possible, consistent with the company turning a profit. That is to say, the less you can pay out to the victims, other things being equal, the better. How many of you have ever dealt with an insurance company? Okay, they have a rule. We don't pay. That's their rule. Every once in a while, you can squeeze a little bit out of them, but the fundamental rule is we don't pay, right, if we can get away with not paying. That is, pay on claims, on just claims under insurance contracts. They don't want to pay because the less they pay, other things being equal, the more they earn. And you say, well, but if they don't pay, they'll fail in the marketplace because of other insurance companies that will pay. Yeah, to an extent. But they all know. And they all have the same incentive to pay as little as possible. So the idea that the market in insurance is actually a free market, for it to be a free market, right, again, and therefore for there to be any reason at all to think it's efficient, right, and that, consumers of the product will get the best value for their money, right, it's got to have complete transparency of information. Do you have the time to go figure out which insurance companies pay at higher rates than others? In fact, have you ever tried to compare straight up two different insurance policies for the same thing? It's like mattress shopping, for God's sake. No two products are sufficiently alike for you to have a rational estimation of which one is better. Typically. And give me a break. Okay. So they will have incentives to pay as little on claims as possible, incentives to secure convictions regardless of guilt. Indeed, it'll be made easier by the fact that we're going to probably give up on the idea that a criminal conviction requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt. You will have incentives once those workers are in there to give them no better working conditions than those needed to yield maximum profits, which, right, is going to be, you give them enough good conditions to sustain them as workers, and presumably with, and enough, and with skimming off of their work what's needed to generate profits for the business, which is going to be viable only so long as you are paying off some premiums. But think of the, right, what do enterprises with workers that have no rights to, do you think this is consistent with the right, with criminals' right to unionize and collectively bargain? Forget it. What do capitalist enterprises typically do with their labor force? Why are we seeing now so many people who were out of a job for a while because of COVID and don't want to go back? It's because they're realizing their work conditions were really crappy. Not worth it. Anyway, the incentives of the insurance companies and partnering businesses diverge from that of the system. The incentive of the system, the point of the system, is to compensate victims. The incentives of the insurance companies and the private businesses are to make profits. Those are divergent aims. And so, what's the reason to think that the aim of compensating the victims will be well managed by a system that is incentivized in other directions? To expect the market for insurance to operate freely so as to assure high rates of compensation for victims, and also at the same time acceptable, whatever that would mean, treatment of offenders, and also adequate profits for insurers and employment projects, that just strikes me as absurd. But of course, the response will be this: hey man, it's a new paradigm. Of course it will have troubles and be less than ideal. But the current paradigm is already completely bankrupt. How are those protections for the treatment of convicts that are guaranteed in a way in our system that wouldn't be guaranteed in the new restitution paradigm? How's that working out for us? How well are we doing respecting the rights of the accused and convicts? In particular, how well are we doing with respect to respecting the rights of accused and convicts who are poor? Oh, really crappy. So how about another system now that maybe doesn't have as many official safeguards, right? It might prove to be, in fact, a big improvement. But I wouldn't stake my reputation on its doing so. And there are also alternatives, right? Like social programs to make it so that people don't need to turn to crime in order to eke out some degree of respect and adequate, means of existence in a society. How about a society that was less doled out social status on the basis of, possessions and, right? How about some fundamental reforms of our values that won't lead to a situation in which you ain't shit if you ain't rich? Anyway, that might be a good start. Yeah.
I'm thinking about Hart's definition or division of the legal system as internal view and external. And I wondered how the law as economics theorist here, how Barnett might respond to someone saying like, this misses the internal perspective or has an incentive people living in the legal system to not even take on.
Yeah, I
I
think
there's an element of care about the law that we tend to have, and that we take as a reason. That this
Yeah.
Not only would it misses that in theory, but it also creates an incentive for that to be reduced on a large scale.
Yeah, I think the answer would be taking up the internal point of view is a phenomenon that's simply inconsistent with the conception of human beings as rational choice agents, self-interested rational choice agents, that is fundamental to this way of thinking. So, that's a little bit like asking a utilitarian, a doctrinaire utilitarian, to say, yes, but what about the fundamental, but what about the categorical imperative? It's like, I don't, or it's like, or to put it in less favorable terms, it's like asking, Laplace where God is in his system. And, he said, well, my system has no need for such a hypothesis. Right? So, but it's a good question. I just think it's talking at cross purposes. Yeah. All right. Yes, Abigail, I will try to get them out by Wednesday. If I don't get them by Wednesday, I will get them in time for you to talk to me about them, both classes the week after Thanksgiving. Okay? But I hope to get them. I will get them out so that you will have some time over Thanksgiving break to think of them. But I hope by Wednesday. Okay? And thanks for asking. Now, let's move on in a little bit of time left to, where's my other one? That's what I want. I want to talk about King and Rawls on civil disobedience. Okay, so, yes?
When the final exam is
Yeah, I think it's December 7th. No, it's early in finals week. I think it's the second day of regular finals, but I'm not 100% sure. But you can look at the exam matrix. It will be due the day, sometime on the day that the final would have been held if it were an in-class final in this class, which you can find on the matrix.
Is it like a similar structure to the
Yes.
term?
Same deal. So what is civil disobedience, and under what conditions is it acceptable? So the first thing I want to say is, well, I'll talk about the context. So these writings, both King and Rawls and then Dworkin, the context is the unrest of the 1950s and 60s. You have, in response to two phenomena. One is the civil rights movement, and one is the Vietnam War. So you have civil rights marches, sit-ins, unauthorized strikes, all that kind of thing, prior to and after Brown versus Board of Education, desegregation generally, and the drafting and passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1965. Lots and lots of protests, including illegal activity, most of it nonviolent, but there were also some violent protests and a lot of protests that were nonviolent on the part of the protesters, but violent on the part of the reaction. You also had peaceful and some less peaceful protests to the Vietnam War. And in association with that, you had a lot of conscientious refusal to be drafted, draft dodging. So there was a lot of unlawfulness about, which is sort of why Richard Nixon managed to get elected on a law and order campaign. So there was a lot of lawlessness. Which, if any of it, was justified, and why? So, King's letter from a Birmingham jail, which I assigned for you to read. This is not a work of philosophy per se. It's on the sort of on the margins of philosophy. But it articulates King's principles for when and how nonviolent, unlawful protest is to be undertaken, when it should be engaged in. And I just want to say, I'm not going to dwell much on the letter from Birmingham jail, but you surely should read it. It is a powerful, powerful piece of writing. There's been all sorts of stuff philosophers have written about civil disobedience, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The influence that it has had in the world is a drop in a huge bucket compared to the influence in the world that a figure like Martin Luther King has. His eloquence is not the eloquence of, particularly of a tight reasoner of the philosophical, analytical sort. Not that he's, slack reasoner, but the man could pretty much move mountains with his words, and you owe it to yourselves and your fellow human beings to read them. But for these purposes, I'm just going to set out what the basic philosophical and strategic moves that he makes. First move is, look, he just up and adopts natural law theory. He quotes Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. And he invokes Aquinas' definition of human law as human code in conformity with God's and natural law. So clearly he does not think of the principles that he's protesting against, not the principles, but the rules that he's protesting against as laws at all. However, some of what was violated in nonviolent action were laws. So part of the thing to notice here is that often you protest a law or a rule that you think is unjust and therefore not law by violating other laws. Indeed, yeah, that's just something to keep in mind. So he also invokes, right, the fact that we have a duty to oppose injustice. And as we'll see, Rawls will also invoke such a duty. Since you have a duty to oppose injustice, you have a duty to violate unjust laws, and perhaps even some laws that are not themselves unjust, as a means of opposing and ending injustice. So, right, what we have fundamentally is a duty to justice, not the positive law. Okay. What makes a law then unjust? He gives three criteria, as it were, or three conditions. Laws are unjust that degrade human personality, turning an I-thou relation into an I-it relation. That is to say, laws that depersonalize and objectify some people. So, segregation laws, right, passed by white majorities that effectively say, I won't drink from the same water fountain as you. You know, we'll pour cement in the public pool rather than let you black kids in it. Codes that a majority group compels a minority group to obey but does not itself obey. Those are unjust. Codes inflicted on a minority that had no effective part in enacting it. So again, segregation laws passed by permanent white majorities, which are permanent white majorities because of voter suppression or various other strategies. Lynching to keep you know, the minority from actually having an effective voice in the legislature. I might have tempted to say, make America great again. The good old days, right? So those are characteristics of unjust laws. So if you find some unjust laws, right? Well, okay, so what are the 4 basic steps in any nonviolent campaign? First, you collect the facts to determine whether injustice exists. Are there unjust laws in operation here? Second thing you do is you negotiate to end the injustice within the law. Seek to negotiate to have the injustices, right, eliminated without violating any laws. If that fails, you have to go through a process of self-purification. This aims to make certain that your motives are pure and that you are committed to in the case to nonviolence, that you will not resort to violence in the course of seeking to overturn the injustice, that you will not return violence with violence, and that you are willing to accept punishment for the violation of law that you do commit without objecting. If you're not, then the suspicion is you're acting out of anger or hatred and not with a clear conscience, simply fighting for justice. Got to make sure that that is your sole motive. And then you take direct action. Violate laws non-violently so as to create a situation so packed with crisis as to force the doors open to negotiation, to get back to being effective in step 2. Point of the violation of law is to re-engage the appropriate means of seeking redress, which is negotiation. And of course, the law that you violate in the course of direct action need not be the one that you are protesting. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. Anyway, keep in mind the natural law backdrop here and the strategic character of King's steps. So he says, an unjust law is no law at all. So violating the unjust laws, right, he doesn't think that that is not law breaking. Okay, so when he's talking here about violating laws, in the case in which the laws are unjust and the ones that are being protested, he's clearly doing this, saying that you have to be taking these steps, right, and that, right, not in order to justify the fact of violating laws, because he doesn't think they are laws, at least where it's the ones you're violating. That's the point. That's the point. He's not justifying the law breaking as though law breaking per se needs justification in the case of unjust laws, right? Because he doesn't think they're laws. This is strategic. This is how we will be effective in eliminating injustice, rather than a prescription for, a set of rules that that stand as a justification, that give evidence of a need to justify the violation of unjust laws. The violation of unjust laws does not require justification because they're unjust, right? This is a point I'm making now because we'll see it again when we turn to, is it Lyons? I think it is. Anyway, objections to King's strategies, and we'll guess we'll get to Rawls next time. Even these peaceful actions have to be condemned because they in fact lead to violence. So you do a sit-in or you do a march, you're just going to irritate those people, and they're going to start throwing rocks and busting heads and lynching. And that's bad. So don't march, don't sit in, don't strike. And King just says that's like condemning the robbery victim for having the money for the robber to steal, or condemning Jesus for the preaching that would lead to the violence of the crucifixion. Don't tell me not to fight injustice because other people are going to get violent if I do. Another objection, the injustice will be righted in time, so there's no need for disobedience. He says, the arc of history bends toward justice, but it is long and slow, and it's only because people are going to fight injustice that it will end. You can't just rely on the efficaciousness of time. Time itself does nothing. It's people fighting injustice, and if it's inevitable that the injustice will be overcome, it's because it's inevitable that people will do things like this. I would further say that's not inevitable at all. Justice winning out is not inevitable at all. But finally, objection. These actions are extreme. Answer, extremism in the cause of justice when nothing else is working is not a vice. It's a virtue. So where there is massive injustice, people are suffering from it, the ordinary avenues of redress are not available, take bold action, because it's justice we're talking about here. It's not optional. Justice isn't an optional benefit we'd like to have. It's something that's morally required. Damn it. All right. That's all. That's my sermon in praise of Martin Luther King for the day. We'll pick up with the Rawls and move on to the Dworkin. I hope to buzz through them pretty quickly. Wednesday there will be class. And thanks for your attention. All right. Bye. Have a good one, Teams people.